Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan and I'm joined by Patrick Watson, who's the Senior Economic Analyst at Mauldin Economics. Welcome, Patrick, and thanks for joining us. Now, you're based in Austin, in Texas.
That's right.
In New Zealand, we've been hearing a lot about the impact coronavirus is having in the US, but it's been really focused on New York, which obviously has been really hard hit. How are things going in your part of the States?
Right. Well, it's certainly much better than New York. That's a terrible situation there. Here, we have had many cases in Texas. Louisiana, which is right next door to us, has been hit very hard. But here where I am, it's not too noticeable if you didn't already know. But they are very concerned, naturally. So in the middle of March, our local government began issuing various kinds of restrictions, and ultimately, so for the last 3 weeks, we've been under a stay-at-home order where people are supposed to not leave their homes except for essential things like buying groceries or pharmacy, that sort of thing. So people have stocked up on food. We're mostly just staying home, and the lucky ones like me are able to work from home. Many others, people who work in restaurants, a whole lot of service industry people have been put on furlough from their businesses. So many of them are hurting because the unemployment insurance system is now overwhelmed with many, many more applicants than it normally gets. So we're starting to see some ill effects from that. The food banks are being really overwhelmed with people who literally are running out of food. So there's some of that. But overall, I think it could certainly be much worse. But again, we don't know how bad it's going to get. The number of cases is continuing to grow, albeit slowly. The fear is that at some point we'll get a sharp takeoff like they have in other places.
Yeah, there's obviously an enormous amount of uncertainty out there. And I think that's something that really gets me with this particular crisis is, one, we don't know how bad it's going to get from a health perspective, and two, we don't know how long it's going to last. So obviously, from an economic and financial perspective, those are two things that markets really dislike. They dislike that uncertainty. And obviously, the US economy is being hit really hard, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. So large parts of the economy are just at a standstill. There are some things that have migrated pretty seamlessly. Programmers, technical people, many of them can work from home fairly efficiently. I've heard some companies are actually finding productivity is up as people are just more comfortable at home. But the service part of the economy, the restaurants, the concerts, anything that involves people being physically together, hair salons, all these are just at a standstill because they've been forced to close. And I say forced to close. In many cases, I think they would be closed anyway because the customers don't want to come, even if they were allowed to, because they're afraid. So yes, it's a big problem because all these people who have now lost their jobs and their income are no longer able to spend the way they have been. In some cases, they can't pay their bills, they can't pay their rent, they can't pay their loans. So it's an enormous mess.
Absolutely. And look, we've been watching with amazement at the sort of numbers of stimulus the Federal Reserve is trying to tip into the US economy. I think the Fed's balance sheet's gone through $6 trillion now. They're extraordinary sums of money. What's your take on, I guess, the efforts by the Fed to date, but also the politicians in the US? Because obviously with your system, with the states are doing their thing, and you've got the federal government as well. So there's a few different a few different focuses there.
Right. So this is a strange blend of things they're doing. So you have there's 50 states, each of which is independent in some ways. But only the federal government can run deficits, and it controls the currency. So it is really the ultimate backstop. So you have this strange situation where the state and local governments are bearing many of the expenses in terms of the hospitals and a lot of the social payments, and a lot of the cost of this is falling on them. But they, at the same time, their tax revenues are falling because people aren't spending money and generating sales tax. So they're in a pickle, and there's a big bind in Washington of whether the federal government will help them. Meanwhile, you have the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is now working in partnership with the Treasury to generate these, I don't even know what to call it. It's so strange and unprecedented, but they're using an amount of taxpayer money as a backstop that they can leverage to buy all sorts of corporate bonds and other assets, private assets. And that is proving helpful to the markets. I'm not sure, in fact, I'm pretty sure it's not going to be helpful to the economy in the long run, because they're simply encouraging businesses that some of which probably should fail to keep them alive, and they will become what you hear of as zombie companies, not being efficient in the way that the economy needs to grow. So this is going to be a big problem, and all this money that they're spending is adding to our debt, which is already quite huge. So where that's going to be paid, no one knows. So it's all quite unprecedented and hard to say where this ends.
Yeah, it is. It is unprecedented. That's a word I'm hearing a lot, and I think it's valid at the moment. Now, John Mauldin has written a lot over recent years about this idea of a great reset, which one quote I saw from him on that was a kind of worldwide bankruptcy. Now, I mean, obviously you work with John, so you're very familiar with his work and contribute to it. Is this the start of his great reset?
I think it is. I think it was coming anyway, but this is probably going to accelerate it. John has been, prior to all this, John was saying that he thinks the 2020s are going to be sort of the run up to a great reset, and in 10 years or so, worldwide debt would grow to a point where it's simply unpayable. And if it's unpayable, then it won't be paid. So how do you organize that? And what he calls the Great Reset would be a kind of global coordinated debt jubilee, as was done in the Old Testament times, that periodically all debts are just forgiven and we wipe the slate clean and start over. And that would be really ugly in some ways because there would be winners and losers, but it would be possibly the best of a bad set of options.
And that sort of move would require some sort of international coordination. One
Yes.
of the themes that we're seeing with this pandemic is there's almost no global coordination. It's almost a case of every country for themselves. So that could be hard to execute in the world at the moment.
Yes, that's a terrible complication that we don't have coordination between nations to the degree we should and have in previous crises. That may yet come because it's necessary if there's to be any sort of good outcome to this. So hopefully the people who are preventing that will come to their senses or be replaced with someone who sees it differently. But we don't know. Things are going to happen whether they like it or not. And it'll be their choice what to do with it. And we all need to hope they choose wisely.
In terms of what your authorities are doing in the States, do you have any particular ideas that you think they'd be better off trying at the moment than what they are actually doing?
Yeah, I'm disappointed at the way the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are bailing out private companies. And I think we have to make distinctions here. There are large numbers of very small businesses that operate on the edge already. Restaurants, shops, just small professional businesses. And them, I think it's the government's proper role to take care of them as best it can. They are the ones who deserve help. Then you have large profitable companies that had plenty of money to buy back their shares and pay dividends and pay bonuses to executives who supposedly should foresee risk and prepare for bad things to happen and build cash cushions and be able to withstand unforeseen emergencies like this. But they did not do that. So now they are being saved. And the argument is, well, they didn't, this isn't their fault either. Well, no, it's not their fault that the virus came along. It is their fault that they don't have any cushion and they're running so close to the edge that now they're at risk of default. But we have a system for this. In the United States, a company, just like an individual, can plead bankruptcy. We have a court system for that. You could go to the court. You could say, I am unable to pay my debts. My company is unable to continue operating and stay solvent. And the court will take over. The court will sort out all the debts, figure out who owes what, and come up with some sort of fair plan to resolve it. And that will all be very transparent. There's open hearings. Everyone knows what's going on. Everyone who's involved has an opportunity to be heard. I think that's a much better way to handle these large companies like the airlines who have found themselves in these positions. But that's not what we're doing. And the precedent that sets is that you can take crazy risks and the taxpayers are going to be there to save you from it. Okay, well, where does that end? And if you're not the one taking the risk, why should you be the one to bear the reward? And that has all sorts of implications for markets, because bondholders get a corporate bondholder gets a higher interest rate than a government bondholder because they are taking credit risk, because the company could conceivably go out of business. But if they're not taking credit risk, why should they continue being paid a premium interest rate? And that's kind of the situation we're headed to. The same thing with stockholders. Why should stocks perform at the way they have historically if the risk that supposedly justifies that reward isn't there anymore? So where that all ends, I don't know, but it's a real problem. We had similar things happen in 2008 and thereafter, and it was hoped we had learned some lessons from it, but I fear we didn't.
It does feel a little bit like history repeating there. Now, you also wrote recently about how pandemics reduce labour supply, and thus there could be some wage rises, indeed some perhaps already happening. Could you just tell us a little bit about what you're talking about there?
Yeah, so one of the things they've done here, the national government has supplemented, as a temporary measure, supposedly temporary, they have supplemented the state level unemployment compensation very generously, which is quite nice and kind and necessary, I think, for many people. The problem is, once you start doing something like that, where does it end? And it's to the point where they've established an incentive to not go back to work, and suddenly doubled what would be the legal minimum wage in many places. So that is going to raise costs for businesses when all this is over, whenever that is. And I think what has happened over the last decade or so is employers gained the upper hand in wage negotiations, because after the last recession, people were happy just to have any kind of job. And they were afraid of losing their job. So they didn't push very hard. And we saw for many years the unemployment rate was very low, but wages were not rising very much, which didn't make sense. And was never going to last forever. And I think we may be reaching the point where that curve is going to bend. And I talked in that article, I talked about a study from the San Francisco Fed, where they looked back historically at pandemics going back to the Black Death in the 14th century. And they're able to see that the result of these has very often been higher wages, years and even decades later, which makes sense if you think about it, because in a war, you have both people killed, and you also have physical infrastructure destroyed, roads, buildings, those sort of things. And those have to be rebuilt, and that's a great expense. In a pandemic, the labor supply shrinks as people die. So when it's over, the surviving workers are able to command higher wages. So situations like this historically have been positive for labor and negative for capital, which is the opposite of what we've seen the last 30, 40, 50 years in the United States and much of the developed world. So that can be a really important change.
Absolutely. Very interesting. You've also written a lot in the last couple of years about the US-China trade war, and you've talked recently about coronavirus being a trade war on steroids. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of tension between the US and China, and that's probably ramped up, if anything, since the virus has spread, obviously. What do you think coronavirus means for globalization?
Well, what we're going to see, for a number of reasons, part of it is there is indeed in the United States a large number of people who believe that this was either some kind of accident or in some cases an intentional plan out of China to unleash this on the world. I don't believe that, but certainly China could have done some things better. So there's that tension, which was already there, the trade war, and this makes it worse. It makes it harder to reach any resolution to that. Not just the United States, but I think many countries are learning that it's, in a situation like this, to be dependent on another country for critical supplies like medicine and medical equipment, or even small things like swabs to take nasal samples. These come from Italy, and Italy has other things on their mind right now, so we can't get them in the United States. So all these goods that for a long time just seamlessly float around and were there when we needed them aren't there now, and governments are going to want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So we will see pressure for a lot of those sort of things to be produced locally, or at least stockpiled locally. And that's going to raise costs. You're going to see the price of some goods rise because they're not going to be manufactured in the place where they can be made most efficiently. So that's going to be a partial reversal of globalization. And globalization was already reversing, in my view. This is due to technology. Robots don't care where you put them. They will work equally hard, and they cost about the same, whether they're in Christchurch or Shanghai or Chicago. So manufacturing, the lower labor cost that allowed developed countries to save money by outsourcing their manufacturing to Asia, that's going away anyhow. So it won't be a straight line. I think it will happen in fits and starts, but globalization is on the downswing, I would say, for sure.
Now, obviously, we spoke at the beginning about the massive uncertainty about this in terms of how bad the health impact, the health crisis gets, and then obviously what that means and for the economic downturn, recession, depression, as some people are already calling it. But I mean, I guess if I ask you to have a look in your crystal ball and with the knowledge we have as we sit here today, what would be your best guess of how this all plays out?
I think we are going to have a recession, a severe recession, a much slower economy for some length of time until we have a vaccine or a very effective treatment for this virus. And I don't know how long that will be. Could be a year or two. So meanwhile, once the most immediate threat passes, I expect here in the next month or two at most, we'll probably be able to leave our homes a little more freely, but it's still going to be different. We're going to be wearing masks everywhere we go. We're not going to have mass gatherings of concerts and sporting events. Restaurants are going to have to space out their tables more widely. All these things add up to a cost, right? So unemployment is going to remain very high. So that's going to last for a while. And we may yet get more waves of this pandemic. It's coming back in Singapore, for instance. They thought they had beat it down, and it seems to be coming back. Same in Japan. So we don't know medically how this is going to play out. But economically, I think the best case is we're going to have a good deep recession here for a while. After that, a lot depends on how attitudes have changed and how businesses have reorganized. I don't see the world we saw as normal 3 months ago is not going to come back ever. We are going to go through a transition period here, and then we're going to have something different. It's not yet clear what that'll be, but I think it will certainly be unlike what we have seen before.
Look, Patrick, thanks a lot for your time today. That's Patrick Watson, Senior Economic Analyst at Mauldin Economics, who's based in Austin, Texas. And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.